between the world of physics and the physical sciences and the biological sciences, and systems in which human beings take part, social systems, markets, complicated systems that depend on people making unpredictable decisions, and yet lead to interesting, surprising outcomes in the collective groups that affect our lives. So we're all living through this recent economic crisis that every day there's another article in the newspaper explaining why it might have happened, who is responsible, and there are many, many directions, many fingers you can point at different places. So perhaps there will be some perspective on that will emerge at the end of this talk. But to begin with, I'd just like to talk about some really simple ideas from physics that teach us an important lesson. And the lesson is that a system that seems really simple, and it seems that we understand all the forces acting in it, and the parts that make up the system are totally understood and extraordinarily simple, those kinds of systems can still lead to very big surprises that defeat our intuition very easily, and we really have very little opportunity to predict the kinds of things that might emerge in those systems. So I'd like to start off by talking about, the picture hasn't shown up.
We see it. We have it.
So is there any way to get the picture up there?
Yes, it is.
Okay, there it is. Okay. So this is a peculiar pattern of stones that can be found in Norway. So this is in the tundra. It's an area called Spitsbergen, and we find these spectacular circles of stones that lie out there on the flat terrain. And I think the intuition would be, if you saw this pattern of stones, that somebody must have put it there, or some maybe biological process, maybe there's a local tribe that pushes these up into this pattern for religious purposes, or maybe there's some animals that maybe store food inside the circles. Instead, the fact is that these circles emerge on their own. The kind of stones and the ground do this all on their own. So if you went up to Spitsbergen and found these patterns and took a broom and spread them out over the surface to make a perfectly flat terrain again, if you then waited for a time, these kinds of patterns would emerge again right out of the soil, right out of the rocks, as if the rocks have some kind of ability to create order out of nothing. So you really getting kind of something from nothing. And this is kind of an astonishing occurrence. In other places, you don't find perfect circles. You find hillsides that are covered with series of ridges, long ridges of rocks that have piled themselves up. And to understand these kinds of things, you can't really look at the rocks themselves. So you can take one rock, take it to the lab, study it for a century, and you never get any clues as to why these things form these kind of patterns. The origin of these patterns is fundamentally a collective thing. It's something that emerges in the system as a whole, and you can't understand it just by understanding the parts. I can give you a short description of how this actually works, and this was only discovered about 6 years ago. So what happens is, in this terrain, it's damp, there's some water, and there's rapid changes in temperature. So sometimes it's frozen, sometimes it's thawed. So you have many cycles of freezing and thawing. And what happens when something freezes with water in it is it expands. So if you started out with these rocks scattered around, some places would have a few more rocks than others. And the places where there are fewer rocks, there's more soil, and it can absorb more water. So when it freezes, those bits expand more than the bits where there's more rocks. This tends to push rocks together into piles that grow taller. And as they grow taller, rocks, of course, tend to fall down the ends. And as they fall down the ends, this expands this pile into a line. And those lines sometimes manage to curl back around and connect themselves into circles. In other cases, they don't. As I said, they cover hillsides. But the interesting thing is there's this collective process that leads to these interesting patterns you cannot understand by looking at the parts alone. I'd like to go on with another very simple example, maybe even simpler. So simple I like to call it a stupid experiment. Why would you ever do such an experiment? So here's the experiment. You take a petri dish, like they use in biology, and you sprinkle some tiny ball bearings into the bottom of it. And you sprinkle enough in the bottom to cover the bottom surface. And then you start shaking it up and down. And you can connect this to a device that will do it in a very controlled fashion, and you can turn up the knob so it goes faster and faster. And you ask the question, is anything interesting going to happen in this petri dish full of ball bearings? And my intuition would be, of course, no, nothing is going to happen. At some point, the frequency will be high enough that some of the ball bearings will begin lifting off the surface each time it goes up. And then you'll get a kind of gas of beads banging into each other, floating around, and I wouldn't expect anything beyond that, in fact. Fortunately, there was a physicist about 20 years ago who thought you might as well go ahead and do the experiment and see what comes out. And in fact, he finds something very, very surprising. So I'll show you some pictures, and let me explain what you're seeing here. So this is, each time the Petri dish is at its uppermost point, you shine some light down, and you take a photo. And so where you see the light has been reflected, that's off the upper surface of some ridges that have formed. Where it's dark, that's where the light has fallen into a hole and can't get back out, so you don't see anything in the picture. So the interesting thing is that at a certain threshold frequency, suddenly these interesting and rich patterns emerge. You get square patterns, increasing the frequency further. You get hexagons. You get lines that cross the system, increase the frequency further, say in the lower right-hand side. You get different regions of the system have different patterns, and there's boundaries, and this system is evolving, and the boundaries are fighting with each other. And it's a kind of world of activity that exists above the level of these beads. And you would just never guess that this is the kind of thing that was going to come out just from shaking some beads up and down in a circular dish. So again, it's a surprising outcome that comes out of a collective system, and there's no way studying a single bead you would ever predict this kind of thing. So Harry Swinney was the guy who did this experiment, and he also found some much more interesting things, even more peculiar. So under other conditions, still just shaking it up and down, if you look at the upper right photo first, this is a particular pattern that emerges that's called an oscillon. So it's just one single little blip of particles. So at one moment, it's up. At the next moment, it's down, and it oscillates up and down, these little beads floating up out of the homogeneous background. And this oscillon, like a single particle in physics, will float around in the system, moving around. The interesting thing is these oscillons come in two different kinds. So when the shaking is up at the top, you can have an oscillon where the beads are up, or you can have a divot, which is kind of an anti-oscillon. So they come in oscillons and anti-oscillons, just like in physics, you have particles and antiparticles. Two oscillons of the same kind will repel each other, just like particles of the same charge. Two of opposite sign will attract one another. They can orbit around each other, forming kind of molecules. In the lower left-hand corner, you've seen a crystal that's formed of many of these oscillons that form a stable system, much like a crystal you'd find in physics. So again, the interesting thing, this incredible world of structure and order and complexity emerges out of the simplest conceivable system you could ever imagine. In the lower right-hand corner, I've just brought in another idea, which is that, in fact, the best way we have to understand these kinds of things at the moment is by using computer simulations, because we understand everything about how beads knock into each other and the physics they use, but it's very difficult to take rapid photographs of these oscillons in enough detail to see how the particles are moving. But with simulations, you can do this in great detail and really get a good picture of how particles flying around in different directions create a stable system overall that gives you this oscillon-like behavior. Okay, one final thing before I'm going to move on to the social world, which may still seem miles away, is just that this kind of collective, interesting behavior that emerges seemingly out of nowhere happens in biology as well. So this is a particular bacterium on the left called Vibrio fischeri, and it's interesting because it has an interesting collective behavior. So these bacteria, we think of bacteria as little single cells that float around in the water, and maybe if they can, they'd like to infect you and give you a disease and something. They're looking for food, but they're not really doing this on their own. So each of these bacteria is always secreting a chemical, and that chemical usually just goes off into the environment. If you have one bacterium on its own, that's all that happens. It secretes the chemical, nothing more interesting comes out of that. If you get 15 of these next to each other, they're all secreting the chemical, so there's a slightly higher concentration of that chemical in the background. What happens when you get millions of these things together, the chemical concentration reaches such a level that each of these bacteria has a receptor on it, which is sensitive to that concentration. So this receptor is a receptor for how many other bacteria around me are there that are just like me. And when that passes through a threshold, suddenly these bacteria will secrete another chemical which creates